Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the newest album from Machine Gun Kelly called Mainstream Sellout. I'm not sure I released a more contentious review that year than when I openly praised Tickets to My Downfall by Machine Gun Kelly in 2020. And it's a review that's become one of the more notable and notorious parts of my catalog, because it wasn't just that I considered it one of the best albums of that year, and I still do, but that I was in opposition to a considerable number of my colleagues and peers who went in on it like the easy target that it is. And okay, look, I get it. It's a far easier album to attack than it is to defend. It's obviously derivative of the pop punk of the past that's now firmly in the 2000s nostalgia cycle. It's pretty damn shallow at best and completely asinine at worst. If you do not buy into its attempts at romance, it can come across as borderline embarrassing. And at worst, it seems like a cringy genre pivot by a cynical act who had just gotten chased out of rap music by dissing Eminem and was now trying a last-ditch pivot in order to save his long-term career. Now, on some level, most of this is true, but there is some context missing to the conversation that I feel gets conveniently ignored. The biggest point coming with alternative music, to which MGK had been laying the groundwork for years beforehand with, albeit limited success. Now, some of the distaste from the critical set, it was undoubtedly amplified by the fact that the landmark pop-punk album Brave Faces Anyone by Spanish Love Songs was in the process of becoming a critically adored near-instant classic and was seeing no mainstream success from it. But I'm sorry, that is a systemic issue with the music industry. And let's be real, there should be some space for dumb, hopelessly melodramatic pop-punk as well as the serious stuff. Push it back 20 years, you could have the Get Up Kids and Modest Mouse while having Sum 41 and Blink 182 at the same time. There is space for both in the conversation. I could also highlight that if we're going to have the arguments about the commodification of pop punk and pop rock, that the 90s and even the 70s were as flagrant with commercial sellouts, including some of those classics lionized now, including openly cribbing from rap music, and that's before we even touch on the moralism argument, which, come on, if you want to know how many acts on Warped Tour who were enabled to do far worse than what MGK may have said in the past, it's a substantial list. But I also think some of this is me coming not from a pop-punk purist, but as someone who heard Machine Gun Kelly in rap circles first, and even covered some of his mostly bad attempts in that arena. If anything, he reminds me a lot of Yelawolf of all people, a white rapper from an area that's not considered a hip-hop hotbed, which translated to influences outside of his genre that he tried to parlay into his art with some very mixed results, not being helped by saying a lot of stupid shit that could alienate him from communities that have considered respect and taste, and eventually having a bad fallout with Eminem that would leave them searching for other genres. And with MGK, you could argue his situation is considerably worse. After a breakthrough single with Bad Things with Camila Cabello that matches precisely nothing in his catalog, and the disaster that was Bloom in 2017, I remember seeing leaked video of him in an office room jumping on tables trying to sell record executives on his vision to leap over to pop punk, and it is flagrantly humiliating, but it places Tickets to My Downfall in the sort of industry context that the average fan and consumer will never see. This really was his last chance with Bad Boy and Interscope, who are looking for all the excuses to drop this dumbass, especially after Hotel Diablo might have satisfied some in his core fan base, but made no inroads anywhere else. So why not lean into the narrative of melodramatic failure and use Travis Barker as a ringer to give it the appearance of a chance? If it fails, wash their hands of him. And if it catches a little bit of success, courtesy of the next nostalgia wave, which they know is coming, well, come on, none of this is built to last. A short-term win, just like signing any SoundCloud rapper in on the next trend. Cash in, cash out. But then Tickets to My Downfall, it was successful arguably propelling Machine Gun Kelly to the most fame he had ever seen after dissing Eminem. It moved a lot of units. It went to #1 on the Billboard 200. It helped amplify the revival of Travis Barker in that scene. It got Machine Gun Kelly booked on the biggest stages he had ever seen, and to the surprise of precisely nobody, it seemed to go straight to his head, which cascaded into a string of highly embarrassing interviews and quotes. But it was also a very revealing type of success if you knew where to look, where Bad Boy and Interscope were happy to reap the rewards and praise the success, especially John Janik at Interscope, who helped found Fueled by Ramen in the 2000s and seems to be MGK's label backer. But they weren't going to put a lot of serious money behind this guy and make him into an A-lister, which is likely why Bloody Valentine and Forget Me Too with Halsey stalled out way too early to make a proper radio run and rule 2021. From all the industry moves, they were still treating MGK as disposable. And from a purely business point of view, it was probably smart. Less because the 2000s pop-punk revival was slowing down, and more because nothing about Tickets to My Downfall was built for repeat success. That's the huge risk of leaning into expectations that this is truly the end. Similar to what happened to American Aquarium when they made Burn, Flicker, Die, expecting it would be their last album, and yet it wound up as one of the best indie country projects of the 2010s. Go figure, and they had to stick around. But that's a band with a respected pedigree and a track record that actually has success, which Machine Gun Kelly has never had, and it made the run-up to mainstream sellout pretty rough to say the least. The singles were not catching fire, the lightning in a bottle didn't seem to be striking twice, and public opinion was turning on him with lightning speed. Although the extremes where some of it went, it felt kinda dubious. If you hate the music, or you think MGK's a total dumbass who has failed upwards and continues to embarrass himself, or that pop punk deserves a better standard bearer than him that represents the more modern, more diverse face of the genre, well, in most cases, I'd probably even agree, even if in the last case, again, more systemic issues within the industry that need long-term change. But in the rollout to mainstream sellout, the fever pitch of the backlash went to places that just felt kind of disingenuous, where it seemed like some were searching for every reason to deplatform MGK, less because of anything he actually said or did, especially in compared to the transgressions of other folks in his genres going on for decades now, but more as just an avatar of a bad system, a reminder of every dumb, skeevy e-boy empowered by his success, which doesn't feel proportionate to his art or any fleeting power or influence that he might have. Again, his label for years now has treated him as utterly disposable. And since here it didn't look like lightning was going to strike twice, again, this formula was not built sustainably, and I was saying that since I praised Tickets to My Downfall in the initial review. So did mainstream sellout prove me right? Well, honestly, yes and no. And even answering it like that isn't really enough to contextualize a project like this, which I think will be easily dismissed by a lot of folks as an overly self-aware, considerable downgrade from Tickets to My Downfall, a series of half measures and poorly constructed experiments that only reinforce Machine Gun Kelly's messy shallowness now that he has made it. But with the larger context of his situation, his history, MGK's catalog, and especially with how Tickets to My Downfall was received, of which MGK was actively, acutely aware, it pulls mainstream sellout into an awkward place that hammers a lot more on the emo side of all this, made all the more disquieting knowing that folks will not be taking this seriously, be it his label or a lot of his newfound audience, the former of whom I would argue should have never pushed this out in the current state he seems to be in, but again, he's disposable. They want to catch the wave, make some money. But as a critic who really liked the kinetic, reckless abandon and fun of Tickets to My Downfall, this album goes to a place where the majority of the execution, it's a failure. It's not really fun until just enough of the emotional beats hit to make you realize that might have been the point. And that opens up a big can of worms I'm not sure folks want to touch. Full disclosure, this is one of those reviews where it could very easily come across like I'm overthinking all of this, and where the shallow trash is very obvious and in your face, why not call it out straight? But the problem with that is how the text often explicitly parallels previous albums where Machine Gun Kelly was not famous, and it's the sort of echo that creates this slightly gross, disquieting feeling that there's more going on here. In other words, this is going to go really long. Strap in for all that. But you know what? Let's start there. And let's start with an uncomfortable assertion. vulnerability is not something that we allow all artists to express. Hell, I would argue we allow it a lot less than we might think, and all of us are guilty, including me as a critic throughout my history. Ultimately, a big part of it comes with finding emotional resonance, of which an artist has to construct, especially in performance, and that's never consistent. It's subject to interpretation, and that's why subjectivity is so important in analyzing all this, and there's no one answer that fits every situation. So going back to Tickets to My Downfall, even at the time I understood why folks heard MGK barreling through emo and pop punk cliches and thought it might have been all an act, even if they knew his history in and around alternative music. I mean, come on, it's not like this guy is overflowing with dignity or intellect or class. He's not exactly someone for whom it was easy to empathize with, especially when he saw a lot of success for what many just considered trash. But there was an emotional core with Tickets to My Downfall plainly in the text that I'd argue consistently went ignored. Beyond the ballads that were very straightforward and earnest, there was a romanticism in the melodrama that frankly showed way more commitment than the swaggering, meat-headed side of 2017's Bloom that MGK has outright admitted in later interviews was a pose. And it was obvious. Hell, you could hear that dogged commitment to dumb romance in all the singles. That's half of why they work so well. And that genuine, earnest emotion has been in MGK's content for a while. 2015's general admission was often honest to a frankly embarrassing degree, and to an online generation increasingly poisoned by irony, and a critical set who couldn't get past some of the very obvious incompetence in the construction and execution. I get why he tried to embrace more swaggering cool and stylism, even if he could never properly sell it. But again, the emotion, the honesty was always there to some extent. So flash forward to 2020, where he thinks pop punk gives him the avenue to be direct and sincere, to say nothing of his last shot at a career, even if he's painfully clumsy at it, and everyone around him treats him like a joke with that success, on top of lingering psychological and mental issues of which he's not been able to address in a whirlwind catapult to fame. Yeah, I kind of get why it might give someone a complex, just saying. But with all that in mind, a lot about mainstream sellout makes more sense. Starting with Machine Gun Kelly's performance. He sounds considerably worse on this album than Tickets to My Downfall. His vocal delivery is rougher and rawer to a much more alarming degree. We're putting him alongside Ollie Sykes and his screams from Bring Me the Horizon on Maybe. It is absolutely a mistake, even if it is one of the better songs here, mostly because of the Misery Business interpolation in the melody. But when you pair it with sloppier delivery and a couple trap flows that he's honestly not handling all that well, it comes across like he was in no fit state to go to a studio to cut the majority of these songs, where it's very easy to buy into all the drug abuse he keeps referencing. And yet, it doesn't feel like the carefree debauchery of that last album as he tries to sketch out the same bad relationship missteps. This is being high to the point of numbness, where the serotonin is just not getting produced in your brain, where it makes a lot more sense that it should that Lil Wayne is on this album twice on Drug Dealer and A, because if you know Lil Wayne's history, he was there across a considerable chunk of the 2010s, not to mention his own adolescent rap rock disaster experiment Rebirth over a decade ago. It's where many of these tracks feel like half-formed fragments and rarely coalesce as fun or as punchy as the last album. If anything, they just feel hollow, circling the same sort of meandering, self-destructive hole that Eminem found himself in when he cut Encore. Now, this is where you could very easily make comparisons to the late Lil Peep or Juice WRLD, especially as more trap elements will creep in the back half of this album, and with lyricism that might feel simplistic or painfully adolescent, especially around women. But the difference comes with, for lack of better words, Machine Gun Kelly failing more obviously at any attempt at coolness or consistency within it, which paradoxically winds up feeling a lot more real as he throws whatever he can at the wall. I mean, see the vast majority of the interviews he's done in the past couple of years, where all the rock star preening and posturing is very revealing of a guy who is in way over his head trying to sell it and failing. But keep in mind that despite understanding what he's doing, it doesn't exactly make for an enjoyable or good listening experience. I mean, compared to the last album, it's not exactly an album that's easy to like on the surface, that can run on hooks or pure momentum or stellar guest performances. You can tell that Gunna and Young Thug absolutely phoned their verses in on Dying California. It's better suited to outright alienating the audience, maybe in a bit of a Hobo Johnson sort of way, and then even fumbling the execution there, or just working way too well for its own good. It's gonna push folks away in droves. Where if I'm at Bad Boy or Interscope, I really don't know how you push or market this in terms of singles. It's not good when it seems like the messy creation leaks all over the finished product. And in particular, as much as Machine Gun Kelly has cultivated a female fan base, there are songs like Emo Girl with Willow and Drug Dealer, where even if he might lack power in these relationships, he's not without agency in his meltdowns, and it can come across like shallow fetishization. Even if he might be going through it, and he's got alternative credentials that might run deeper, you would think he would know a little bit better than to just default to the broad, shallow basics. But this is where, as a critic, you crash directly into how seriously you take an album like this, how much you value how much an artist might want to try to express their problems, either in the text or subtext. Because on one level, it is very easy to build up some detachment and say, you just don't. Especially if you don't believe it, or for an album leaning so heavily on self-critical metatext as this one is. Especially when it feels as shallow as this one does. Now this is where working in this style of upbeat Blink-182-esque pop-punk is as much of a curse as it is a blessing here. Until the final third of this album, and if you ignore a lot of what MGK is actually saying between the lines, you could argue that the brighter major chord focus and reliance on blunt language feels like any other generic pop-punk act in the 2000s, romanticizing and commodifying their angst to play to an adolescent audience who are going to take it on face value. Sloppy framing that pisses everyone else off in the meantime, especially those of us who grew up in the 2000s who have heard this same shit done before. I mean, we're supposed to grow. Pop-punk's supposed to be better than this, right? After all, how much does anyone want to hear a successful artist whinge about their personal lives and all the drugs that they do, and even scoff at how people didn't like their previous projects? I don't know, maybe we should ask the diehard fan bases of Eminem and Kanye West about that, just saying. But you know what? That's different, you might say. They're actually good, accomplished artists with catalogs that are worthy of respect, and they also have considerably more power and resources to manage themselves in the public eye, but I would digress. Machine Gun Kelly is a bad artist, obviously a limited artist, plainly lacking in the unique genius as much as he tries, and fails to claim that he is one too. And while I could throw up the catalogs of a slew of modern emo rappers who are now heralded as genius after their passing, but where that same criticism could have been applied, I think the more interesting question is how we value the vulnerability of an artist coming less down to the validity of their emotions or intent, and more how we might consume the craft. Now this is where I could also highlight in recent years something among label promotional departments called the mental health rollout, where artists are coached to speak a lot about their mental health struggles in order to come across as more relatable to the common audience. And while there's probably a lot of truth there in terms of that visibility, and that's a good thing, for those who know, it can come across as artificial or pandering at best. And while I'm not going to throw that allegation at MGK, if you get Pete Davidson on the Interlude Wall of Fame, well, it depends how cynical you are about this, really, because it's very easy to go there. Now, of course, it's interesting, and that's not really how MGK promoted the album, where a lot more of the buzz seems to circle his impending wedding to Megan Fox, or some shambling rock star preening, which to many will make any stabs at death on this album feel shamelessly inauthentic, targeted at teenagers in the shallowest ways possible, and yet upon multiple re-listens, it's hard to avoid the songs that are just explicitly this. The same attempts to recapture the wild energy of the singles of Tickets to My Downfall, not bother to go a shred deeper, the single Emo Girl with Willow being the most flagrant example of this. No wonder it was one of the lead-off singles. And then there's the very obvious attempts to recapture the alchemy of My Ex's Best Friend, the biggest hit from Tickets to My Downfall, Make Up Sex with Black Bear, and Fake Love Don't Last with E and D, or even if they might have better construction and feel more fun, within the larger context of the album, they can't capture that same vibe. They don't have that same pop. And this is where I will admit more than a few points where maybe this is just a failure on its face, and there's no greater significance to many of these songs just being sloppily produced junk derivative of Blink-182's darker moments, where the hooks are weaker, the mixing and the mastering is still painfully rough and letting the guitars build any sort of muscle, and especially around any of the synths, the melodies just don't have that same pop or flavor, and more often than not, the songs are just blindingly incoherent the more you think about them. Even if I think the bass lines as a whole tend to be a little bit better across this album, the one thing Travis Barker tends to get right with Machine Gun Kelly, if nobody else in his little pop-punk crew. But a song like God Save Me is just too flailing in its scattershot targets to land. Same with the slapdash attempt at hardcore on World War IV. And even then, the more studio chatter that's left in, the more the artifice seems to snap into focus. So Machine Gun Kelly is trying to get to something a little bit more real. He is compromising whatever atmosphere might be here. But again, it isn't just that many of these songs can't get there, but they're juxtaposed with moments where the failure is obvious. It becomes all the more revealing. I've said that this album is less fun, but that's also because it is considerably darker, and it doesn't have to be, and it doesn't match any of the marketing at all. Hell, the easiest thing to do would be make Tickets to My Downfall 2, especially with a lot of the same creative team co-writing and producing, but that's not what happened. And it's not really a more money, more problem situation, so much as the fame Machine Gun Kelly has received has only amplified his existing issues. The closest to the straightforward complaints is probably Dying California, but he's more openly furious with his label on the expanded version of Paper Cuts, especially in that final rap verse, where in trying to force a comparison to Kanye West's Donda, it feels simultaneously empty, but also way more revealing than he might intend. He's also clearly stinging from the backlash online to the title track, where on the very first song, in the opening lines, he's openly contemplating a premature exit to it all. It's hard to say it's all a pose or just a victory lap. Where I think the term becomes a lot more obvious is on 5150, a code from where there's probable cause for someone to be taken in for psychiatric evaluation for 72 hours, and where MGK openly wonders in his verse whether or not he's romanticizing the wrong things by mentioning it in a pop-punk context, in a similar way that Youngblood got in trouble for his 2017 album. In my opinion, yeah, you know what? Pop-punk framing's probably irresponsible, but the song also isn't any good, and it fails to capture any potent atmosphere. It honestly kind of feels more authentic to MGK's ham-fisted breakdowns that only amps up speed on cuts like the drugged-out A. And it becomes hard to get away from this sick feeling in your stomach when you get to Sid and Nancy, which to some will feel wildly unearned for Machine Gun Kelly of all people to retrace the story of Sid Vicious. But on the other hand, if you know the true history of the Sex Pistols and how much of a flagrant, phony construct that band was, especially within the 70s punk scene, and you've recognized the bleak, self-destructive romanticism that's been in MGK's work for years now, especially in the context of this album, I mean, there's more parallels than there should be, especially ending with Twin Flame as a very desperate love song for Megan Fox. Clumsy, little embarrassing, absolutely a little cringe. Yeah, but that's a lot of modern romance. In the context of an album that's a messy downward spiral, I gotta say it feels real. And that's kind of why this album is so difficult to talk about. Because on so many levels, it's obviously worse. With so many of the bad choices, they only reinforce a meltdown that gives this album a greater sense of emotional honesty. It feels like it's coming from a more authentic place. The mechanisms of pop punk are here, but they're intentionally hollowed out and less fun, which yes is the point and feels honest to who he is, but it's also a choice that kills the album replayability. It's also not an album where you have the people who will like this ironically. It's too nakedly flawed to get away with it, and that's one reason I can't say it works on some levels. There are too many places where a more cynical mind will see transparent phoniness, even if where he's going through the motions reflects a damaged mind, it still is going through the motions. But on the flip side, there's enough broken pieces here where I can't deny Mainstream, Sellout, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do, where the artist in one last-ditch chance to be honest became a joke and then found success, and the paradox of being trapped in that diseased miasma of confusing privilege, drug abuse, fame, and the knowledge of his own disposability has him seeking any possible escape. I mean, there's this sick resonance to that, where every fuck-up only reinforces the album's emotional core. Now, a smarter and better album would interrogate all those systems that cause it, and smarter and better critics would do the work to recognize and critique them as well. But there is some catharsis in the desperate, obviously failing struggle at the core of mainstream sellout. And while I can't in good faith recommend it, a lot of folks will not have the history, nor will want to see the reality of who MGK seems to be or who he's impacted by, or they won't connect with all the botched execution, of which I completely understand. I can't escape the feeling that there is more here. For what it's worth, it's an album that lives up and down to its title. I wish more folks recognize the implications of all that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I would be extremely grateful. I said way too much about this album. I fully know that. Again, I probably overthought this, but there's a lot here that I think is going to get brushed aside or considered phony or cynical or pandering, and I don't see that. It would be easier to do that, and that's not what this album's doing. But hey, if you guys would like to like and subscribe or leave comments on your thoughts, have fun down there. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in the scheduling process, or hell, just argue with me at some point or support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.